I was confused. I thought you were calling me your favorite person. Hey, podcast listeners, Rio Wong with you once again with Nonprofit Lowdown. Today, I am excited to invite my friend and fellow colleague, Maria Rio. She is the founder and CEO of Further Together and the host of the podcast, The Small Nonprofit. And today, we are here to talk about community-centric fundraising. Maria, welcome to the show.
Yay, so excited to be here. Hi, everyone.
And I love that we both have the fancy mics because you know that podcasting life.
You gotta have it.
All right, friend, before we jump into community centric fundraising, which I know is your area of expertise, tell us a little bit about your fundraising journey because, as we know, except for Sydney Wagman, most of us did not wake up one day and say, I want to be a fundraiser when I grow up.
You know what's funny? I think I kind of did and kind of didn't. No, I actually really wanted to get into law. But let's go back a little bit. So I came to Canada as a refugee when I was 9 years old, and I lived in a World Vision refugee shelter in Toronto. So I was using a lot of charitable services growing up, food banks, getting gifts from strangers, drop-ins, that kind of stuff. So when I had the opportunity to fundraise for World Vision, I really jumped on it. So I saw people that were fundraising on the street. They were wearing the vests. They were from public outreach. I would find out to learn. I would find out later. Um, and they were pitching people to become monthly donors. So I actually became one of those street outreach people. And I did that for a few different clients. So I started with World Vision, but I did it for UNICEF, UNHCR, World Animal Protection. So kind of very local and very international brands that gave me a lot of opportunity to see how people told their stories, how they solicited people, and just that kind of behind the scenes of many nonprofits and that agency experience. So I learned a lot in those 4.5 years that I was there. So I did streets, I did malls, and then later I also did a little bit of phones. So I got quite a lot of expertise working at that agency.
Wait, before you go further, I have so many questions about this because I've never done, the street and cold calling. How did you do it? Because it feels like it would be so demoralizing because they're ignored so much. I always think about these poor people on the street. I'm just like, oh God, the
Oh my
rejection must
God,
be horrible.
you get so good at it. I actually like, I don't know, it was really fun. So basically, they teach you a lot of different things. So one of them is actually doing a pitch and doing close, right? So getting the gift. But a lot of the other parts are psychology. So how do you actually build a 5-minute friend conversation with this random person who may or may not have heard anything about your organization and may or may not be in a complete rush to get out of there, right? So really, my style, my flavor of fundraising has always been charm. So just being like, oh, is that for me? And they're carrying a coffee or something. Oh, if they had their name written on their cup, like at Starbucks,
Yeah.
hey Matt, how's it going? Long time no see. Then they stop.
And they're
They
like, did
start,
you know you? Yeah, right.
yes, yes. They start talking to you and they're like, so how do I know you? And you're like, you don't,
Oh my gosh. Wait,
right?
Marie, so like what was your conversion rate? Because I don't know, like data point of one, I always like I do everything in my power to avoid those people, but it sounds like you were super successful. It's like, what was the secret?
So conversion rates, it's kind of a hard role because you're getting people to give long term. You're asking them to become a monthly donor. And from the research that we had available at the time, monthly donors were giving 5 to 7 years if they signed up with a face-to-face fundraiser. So it was that kind of like long-term support that we were looking for. So you couldn't sign up just anyone. If they told you they were like on social assistance, you can't sign them up, right? If they told you like I don't have a bank account or I'm 18, right? Like we were looking for really quality donors and we were hoping to sign up at least one person every single day for a monthly gift of, $30 to $50. So by the end of the week, you had, I think, like 6 to 7 packs pre-authorized contributions that you were responsible for acquiring every single week. Um, but that being said, I did have some teams that I ran that were far exceeding that. So instead of raising like $100 in packs for like one person, they were raising like $200 in packs for one person. So it was a really, really great experience in the learning that I had. It was very hard as a job, like it was not easy,
Yeah, I'm
but I learned a
sure.
lot.
Yeah. Well, and I think what's great about that is you got the reps in, right? Because I think so often fundraisers, they just don't get enough at bats. They don't practice the solicitation. They don't, they like they're afraid of rejection, so they don't actually ask. And with your situation, you're literally out there like getting your reps in.
And the rejection piece like went away really fast in that way, in that role, because all I had to do was say, "Hey, the worst they can do is say no." Right?
Right.
And that's kind of your mantra for 4 years.
Hmm. And so is it just like a numbers game when you're doing that kind of fundraising?
Yes and no. If you get too kind of like desperate for someone to sign up, they can smell it. So it's also like the psychology piece is really, really important. So making sure that you're not forgetting to, qualify them as a lead, making sure that you're creating that relationship so they, stay around to give you their information and there's that trust because you're just a stranger on the street, right? So why would they give you their credit card?
Yep.
So just making sure that you're hitting all those psychological fundraising wins before you actually hit the ask. And then like addressing concerns. So, hey, I actually have to go. Okay, can I walk with you? If you really want to get involved, can I walk with you and, get you started? So there's some pieces that it really taught me how to be persistent and how
Mm.
to maintain that kind of like levity to the situation. And
Mhm.
it also taught me a lot about how I use my personal lived experience in fundraising.
Mhm.
So, like again, I lived in a World Vision refugee shelter and I fundraised for World Vision. So while
Mhm.
I was fundraising for World Vision, I would go up to people and I would say like, "Look, like I know that this works personally. How many times do you
Mm.
get to meet a beneficiary like from a country that does a lot of international work, right? So I know that this works." And the reaction was kind of a mixed bag. And it actually really hurt my feelings and sometimes because sometimes there was no reaction. Like they didn't care. They're like, whatever.
Mm. Mm.
And for me, it's like, how could you not care? Like, there's
That
kids
seems
that
that seems weird, like, in Canada. Canadians are supposed to be so nice.
yeah. Well, not everybody lives up to their expectations, but there's also like people are passionate about different causes, X, Y, and Z. So there were some things that I needed to learn about how I talked about my lived experience, like how much information was too much, like how much was too little, and people don't actually understand the story and don't feel inspired. And then like if I wanted to actually bring that to the forefront, which, years later we see that I have. Like that's something that I still continue to really carry with me. My lived experience is part of my fundraising and really centering the people who use the services.
Okay, well, I'm so glad that was a really fun detour. So, okay, you started off doing these, like, street teams, and then you moved into the phone, and then at some point you were development director doing communications.
Yeah. So
Walk me
after
through.
4.5 years at public outreach, I moved into nonprofit proper. So no longer an agency setting, but like in a nonprofit. And that was really interesting because I finally got to see the other side of what I was
Mhm.
doing at public outreach. So, like working with CRMs and mail merges and all these like tiny details that make a huge impact once you've actually closed the gift and gotten that information, right? So eventually I became a director of development and communications at the Canadian Civil Liberties Association, which was great, really fun. Not sure if it lived up to my experience, my expectations of like social justice warrior-y. So I
Mhm.
ended up switching roles to working at a small community food center that provides like food and community gardens, that kind of stuff to people in the community. Which again, like I had a lot of fun. The team was great. We actually got to do a lot of community-centric fundraising at that organization, but I felt it was because there was no ED for quite a bit. So it was
Mm.
kind of me and
Mhm.
the board can choose to try to force me to throw a gala, which I'm not going to do, or fire me, which they're
Mhm.
not going to do.
Right.
So it was a really interesting evolution of how I saw fundraising as a tool for advocacy, but also as like how much power fundraisers actually carry in their
Mhm.
organizations. Because if someone tries to push some of those things forward and they're in a program capacity, they might not have the same kind of like sticking power. So like
Right.
a board might actually just fire you, whatever. But when
Right.
you're the fundraiser, you hold the purse strings. So there's a little bit more of a hesitation to do so.
Got it. So let's talk about community-centered fundraising. When did this first come into your awareness and what was so appealing about it for you?
I don't 100% remember when I first became aware of community-centric fundraising. It was probably when I was at the Canadian Civil Liberties Association, because I remember sitting in an AFP like session that was being done online. It was a workshop, and just the answers there made me feel so uncomfortable with the sector. There was a breakout room, and they were asking like, if a donor says something racist, what would you say back? Like, how do you handle that situation? And it's all white women except for me and this other racialized person who had their camera turned off. And I was like, come on, don't leave me alone here with them, right?
Yeah.
And they're like, well, I wouldn't say anything. Maybe they're having a bad day. Maybe, like it would jeopardize the gift. Like this was
Oh
before the murder of
no.
George Floyd. So I guess people
Right.
were like less cognizant about it.
Yeah.
But also, like, I had been asked at this organization to like put on an accent and talk to donors and put on an accent and do the like video for the organization. And, it's World Hijab Day. Let's all put on hijabs and
Oh
post it on
no.
social media. So, like, ridiculous things that kept kind of like grating at me as a person. And, like, because like my lived experience and my personal identity is so tied to my professional identity, like it was even more harmful for me to like come to work and fundraise for a cause that like I know that I'm getting this kind of treatment internally, right? So it was
Mm.
very difficult, which is unfortunate, and I'm
Hmm.
sure there's a lot of people who face similar experiences as women of color in the sector, but it's very, very difficult. And I don't know. I think that's when I bumped into Vule's blog, Nonprofit AF, or as it was called then, Nonprofit with Balls. But it was just like slowly kind of seeing what Vu was talking about, and then other people in the Nonprofit Happy Hour Facebook group, what
Hmm.
they were talking about, what they were exploring, kind of led me to think of like, oh, there's a different approach here
Hmm.
that hasn't been kind of maximized. And I would love to kind of see how I can apply it, because it's always
Hmm.
a learning journey. Like, you don't wake
Yeah.
up being like an amazing ally and a great communicator who never uses the wrong words, X, Y, and Z. So being able to apply it in a small scale while I was at CCLA, like instead of saying like that homeless person, it's that person experiencing homelessness, right? Like
Right.
really learning these small pieces to then build upon over the years. So I think that's when I first heard about it. And what really enticed me about it was that commitment to justice and to service users. So making sure that we're not kind of centering our egos and our brands, but really trying to support the people who need it, which is something that I always wanted to do, even when I thought I was going to go into law.
So, for those of us who aren't as familiar with community-centric fundraising, can you help us understand, like, how would you define it? What are the principles underneath it? And well, let's start with those questions. What is it? How would you explain it?
Yeah, so community-centric fundraising, which I also say CCF interchangeably for anyone listening, is a fundraising model that's grounded in equity and social justice. So it's all about prioritizing the community over individual organizations and working together as a team. So instead of working in silos in your organization for the betterment of your own brand, it's how can we come together to pool our resources, pool our knowledge to better address systemic issues, and instead of trying to work piecemeal and not really have that long-term change. So that is basically in a nutshell what community-centric fundraising is, which is a little bit different from donor-centric fundraising
Hmm.
because CCF focuses on collective well-being and collective liberation, equitable resource distribution, and systemic change, rather than how can I maximize donations for my organization alone, right? How can I make sure that this donor feels like they're the center of our world when we should be centering the community and the service user? It has 10 principles. So
You don't have
10
to remember
principles.
them.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I was like, they're available on the CCF website. But a lot of them are kind of like focusing on how we treat everyone equally. So how do you treat your staff? How do you treat your volunteers? How do you treat your board members? How do you treat a major donor versus someone who gives you like $10 a month? How do you make sure that they all feel like they're part of the community and like partners in the work, right? So this nonprofit isn't mine, the EDs, it's not mine, the donors. It's all of our responsibility to make sure that these people are getting the help that they need, whether that's like food or access to art or whatever it might be. Like this is our collective belief, and now put your money where your mouth is.
So, one of the things that I have been pondering with community-centric fundraising is, I'm familiar with the principles. I've been in, the Slack channel and so forth. It seems to be very clearly applicable to, say, foundation fundraising, where you're talking with your program officer. Um, I've not been able to wrap my head around how it might be more directly applicable to, say, major gift fundraising. So I'm curious if you have a use case or like an example of how we might be thinking about CCF principles with major gift fundraising.
Absolutely. So major gifts was a hard one to kind of like wrap my head around. And for anyone listening, like this might not perfectly apply to your organization. Because, for example, having a child experiencing poverty holding a check is very different from having a dog holding a check, right? Or pinning it to a tree. Like it's not exactly the same. So really, you have to center your community to kind of inform what the direction is going to be. But when I did a lot of like major gift CCF rejigging, I did it at the Stop Community Food Center. And what we did there is we did a few different things. So first was having conversations with donors about community-centric fundraising, white supremacy, tax avoidance, all those kind of things that play into the nonprofit industrial complex. So not only are you a part of this problem by avoiding taxes by giving me your money, but I am also part of this problem by taking your money to, continue to fund programs for people who are in legislated poverty.
Hmm.
So like how can we break that cycle? Like we're both trying to help. That's all that we're trying to do, right? But how do we actually long term make sure that there's a better solution in the works, right? So encouraging people to do advocacy was something that we did as well. So we would talk to our foundations and major donors about signing petitions and talking to their representatives. Um, we also removed a lot of the recognition that we had available to our major donors.
Hmm.
So instead of naming every single person who gave over $1,000, we named every volunteer. So there was like 300 volunteers who were spending like 3 months minimum with us, and they were getting almost no recognition. So making sure that we were recognizing them for their contribution, naming one of our programs after one of the volunteers who passed away versus a major donor.
Hmm.
Um, and one of the other examples that I thought was really cool was we did something called a shared platform fund.
Hmm.
It's not a good name. It was hard to say, but it was a really interesting idea. So what we did is we surveyed 200 of our service users and we asked them, what are your top public policy priorities? So the top three was affordable housing, increase or free dental care, and increase social assistance rates. So those were the top three, and that helped us inform all of our communications and our discussions with major donors. What we had been thinking about was, wouldn't it be cool if we could get, a major donor to give us $50,000 and then 25 of that goes to an organization chosen by our community. So kind of like getting the major donor to reimagine what philanthropy can look like. And do they
Mm.
have to have power and control over the funds? Do we, as a larger white led organization, like, do we? I don't know. Probably not. Right.
Hmm.
So having those conversations were super interesting. We had two donors who one gave 25, one gave 25, 25 went to us. And the rest we put to a vote from our service users who were all part of this cohort in one of our programs to vote on the top organization that they wanted to get $25,000.
Mm.
So it was just really small and big changes, and also reimagining how we did events. So instead of doing a gala, as I said, like I wasn't about to do a gala around people experiencing food insecurity. Like that's so
Tone deaf.
unaligned.
Yeah.
It's so unaligned that, Arrested Development did it in their first pilot episode. That it's like this person that's like super fancy. What's her name? Lindsay Bluth. just like eating chicken. She's like, ah, sorry, I'm too hungry. Sorry, I'm too full, right? I can't have another bite. It's just like so misaligned. That's already being parodied. So I don't know why we're doing that. But anyways, small tangent. We moved away from donor-centric events so we could actually start making events for our community. So one of the ones that we did was pizza with the politicians. So we had elected representatives come in and talk to our service users, and donors were also invited to come as well. So
Mm-hmm.
it kind of removed this kind of like, I'm a donor and you should thank me, but it's all getting to know each other and actually building that community and that partnership.
Mm-hmm. That's a really nice way to put it. I'm wondering, because I know a lot of folks are out here thinking, the minute you said like talking to our donors about tax avoidance and white supremacy, I can hear EDs be like, no, like I can't do it. So I'm just curious, how did that go for you? And did you find any of your major donors like resistant to that? Did they stop giving? Like what was the outcome of that?
They were so open to it. I don't know if it was because it was like post George Floyd and like people
Hmm.
were already thinking about like their wealth and the relation between them and like our service users. But we started having those conversations by centering the community. So, hey, I care about this, you care about this. Why do you think people are poor? Yeah, because they don't have enough money, right? Because they're an ODSP, which is the Ontario Disability kind of support, or they're on welfare, like they just don't have enough money. Maybe they're a newcomer, X, Y, and Z. Like a lot of these are structural barriers, right? They're not because they don't have enough food. They're hungry because they don't have enough money and they don't have choice and autonomy and dignity, right? So, like, what's the next logical step after that? So, like, why don't they have enough money? Well, because the government only gives them X amount as a social assistance rate, right? Okay, so why does that happen? Right? So you kind of start following the why, but kind of like that imagery of a drop and the circles, the waves kind of come out from that drop, right? Same thing with this. Like you start really centering your community and talking about like why is this happening? What are the systemic issues and barriers that people are facing? And then how does that relate to you and to me? Because I'm also
Hmm.
part of the nonprofit industrial complex, right? Like it's hard to bite the hand that feeds you, but we have to because otherwise people will continue to experience poverty for the next 100 years. Like it's not okay for us to just be okay with doing the thing that makes us feel good. Like it actually has to lead to something. And I think a lot of donors were very receptive to hearing that. And some of them actually thanked me
Hmm.
or came to talk to me about community centric fundraising. So whenever
Hmm.
we would put a piece out there for like our blog or our email, donors would reach out and be like, oh, I've never thought about that. Can you tell me more? So I talked to
Hmm.
people about their taxes. And then they said, like, oh, I didn't know I wasn't supposed to be doing that. Like I didn't know that if I didn't like fund my full obligations to the government, like it might have this impact on other services, right? So that was one really interesting conversation. Another one was with this donor that was giving $50,000 a year and had actually lapsed for 2 years. But because of this conversation around community centric fundraising, they came back and they were asking us, like, so how does this work? This sounds very interesting.
Hmm. Hmm.
But also, some other donors were saying, like, oh, it always felt weird to eat, a $300 meal when we're talking about food insecurity. Or like it always felt weird when I was coming in to do a tour and there's people who are experiencing poverty and I'm just there like, oh, look at me, like I don't want my name on the wall looking down on them. Like it doesn't feel right. And those were the kind of things that I was hearing from people. So I definitely knew that I was on the right track. Um, and then having like donors actually participate in the education of other donors was really cool as well.
Hmm.
So we had one donor who wrote a blog post for us on like why they believe in trust-based philanthropy. And they were able to kind of like share that with our audience. I actually made a really good relationship with one of our billionaire donors, and I had them on my podcast recently around trust-based philanthropy and how they try to do it as a grantor. So we were their grantee, and it was really interesting to just have those conversations and build together.
As you're talking, Maria, what's coming up for me is that the ways in which I'm coaching people to think about fundraising, like I don't call it CCF, and certainly there might be differences, but at the end of the day, it's like talk to people, like just treat them like human beings and don't assume that you know what they want or what they don't want. Like communicate. see if they want to learn more, see if they want to be educated, see if they want to come to events. Because I think we spend so much time thinking whether it's for our donors or for our beneficiaries, like, oh yeah, they're definitely going to want this, right? But we program without their consent. We program without their feedback, and then we're like, how come it didn't work? Or like, how come we've created this weird power dynamic? It's like, well, because you didn't ask.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that's one of the disadvantages like of working inside a nonprofit is because CCF, you're supposed to treat everyone equally. So the charity included. But usually the charity sees such little value in what they're pitching a donor that they feel so uncomfortable. Like it has to be what the donor wants because they have the power, they have the value. But they don't see it as from the donor's perspective of like they are able to affect the change. Like my vehicle is just a way to do that, but they are the ones that do it, right?
Right. You
So
guys are the experts. You tell me. Right.
exactly. So like they're not really willing to talk to the donor and say like, "Hey, we actually don't need, 500 backpacks donated. We actually need just like the money to buy food." Like we're not even thinking about that just yet. We'll let you know when we are, right? But a lot of charities put themselves so below a donor
Hmm.
that they just like don't even feel comfortable treating them like partners. And that's one of the main pieces of community-centric fundraising. Like you're not above your service users and you're not below your donors, right? Like
Yeah.
treat everyone as if they deserve your respect and as if you value their opinion.
Yeah. I'm so glad you said that. I think sometimes I see fundraisers come into the conversation, especially with major gift donors, either like with this supplicant energy, which is not helpful, or almost like a resentment of like, oh, like this rich person. I'm like, well, in a sense, aren't you also doing the same thing of stereotyping them because they have money? Like, shouldn't everyone have the chance to connect and be a human being and show you who they are? And if after that interaction they show you that they're a jerk, then like, okay, maybe they're a jerk. But like, I think there's this assumption that like because you have money, you must be a bad person.
100%. And that actually sometimes makes me feel really bad, which like, oh, feel bad for the multimillionaires, boo-hoo, But like it makes me feel bad because they really want to help and like they're so open to being educated and like to doing their best. And like you see how far they take it once they have the information. Like I've seen donors like flourish into community-centric fundraising and just like I don't know why some people have that mentality. I think it's because maybe they don't actually build those true relationships with donors.
I think
Like
I think that's right.
it's just about transactional, which is like not great for anyone.
Yeah. Well, I also think I think a lot of people in our sector have been trained in these transactional models of like, okay, we're just gonna, do stuff to them and then they'll give me what I want, right? As opposed to being like, this is a human being who has needs, wants, desires, ideas. Like, why don't we just talk to them like humans? So that's the first thing. And the second thing is I think a lot of fundraisers have a lot of stuff about money, whether it's baggage or trauma. And it, in the absence of actually doing the work to unearth and heal the trauma, they put it and they project it onto people, which also is not very helpful when you are in major gift fundraising.
Yeah. I think that's one of the parts that I love so much about planned giving fundraising, like
Mm,
an offshoot of major gifts, because you actually get to really start talking about people's like values and how they live them and what they want their legacy to be. And that to me is just so special and so intimate. Like we're so aligned and we're vibing, or maybe we're not, and you're not the right person for this organization, maybe, right? Depending on the values. But just having those experiences is so helpful to build that relationship and not be transactional and really make people feel like partners. So it's not only just for planned giving, you could do that for major gifts, you could do that for monthly donors, right? Like just treating people like people can go so much further.
I'm so thank you for explaining this to me because I realized that maybe I am a community centric fundraiser this whole time and I didn't know it because I never called myself a community centric fundraiser. But the way you explained it actually makes a lot of sense to me. But let's talk about community centric fundraising because as you're talking about it and as we're talking about relational fundraising, it seems like a lot of work. See, especially because your average nonprofit is understaffed, overwhelmed, under-resourced. And the work that you're talking about takes time, right? It takes time to build relationships. It takes time to build trust. It takes time to treat people like they're human beings and do things like, being thoughtful about inviting them to things, writing that personal note, et cetera, et cetera. So talk a little bit about the real constraints that people may find around implementation of CCF.
Yeah, I think time-wise, like the work of justice always takes a long, 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 long time, unfortunately. So if you want to be a good fundraiser and you want to be like justice aligned, like those both take a large amount of time because it's all about consistency. You can't just, write a thank you letter and expect this person to give year after year after year. Like they need to be updated, they need to be engaged, you need to be building that partnership with them. Like they have to own it just as much as you do. So that's one piece that will never go away. But I don't see that as a barrier as much as I see like board members as a barrier. Because most of the time, like they don't really understand. First of all, they don't understand donor centric versus community centric. They just know I saw this on Instagram and you should do it. Kill me.
Oh my God.
you
I
know.
literally just got off another podcast episode with Melissa Metzel about board members and how they don't understand what the nonprofit actually does.
So that was like one of my biggest barriers working in house. Like I was doing all the things. We were getting media around this. Like our donors were loving it. They were actually talking to other organizations about what we were doing so well. We were partnering with other organizations to talk about each one of the 10 principles of community-centric fundraising. And then I had my board being like, well, you doing that media piece about how we're doing so well about community-centric fundraising is a little bit braggy. And it's kind of like, okay, first of all, I'm not even going to address the sexism, right? But like
Or the
just
racism. Like, I think we're seeing now what happens when women of color are in positions of power. People have a lot of opinions about that, but you know what? We're going to move
yeah.
on.
We were raising more than ever before. I closed $1 million gift. We were getting like it was like 200 million AVE like media impressions or something like that. So, by all metrics, I was absolutely crushing it. And they were still like, well, what about the gala though? And I'm like, what are you talking about? Like, we already have first of all, the organization was unionizing. So, my gala person is now a foundations person, raising like double the amount. People know, and we've been putting this out there for a year, that galas are elitist. And now we're going to do a gala? Like, what don't you get?
Hmm.
So that was like one of my biggest barriers. Like it wasn't the staff, it wasn't anyone internal except for the board. And my donors were loving it. They wanted more. They were putting in their time, effort, and money. Like
Mhm.
$25,000 for the community to decide where that goes is so innovative. It's so like top notch CCF. Like it was chef's kiss. And like my board being like, oh, but like galas, I like galas. And it's like, oh, the other thing too is like the power that they try to like wield over me. I was like, I'm not doing a gala. So like if you wanted a white fundraiser, you could have gone get one. There's
Mhm.
like a lot of white fundraisers out there who might be a perfect fit for you, but you hired me as a refugee, like Mexican lady, and that's not what I'm gonna do.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
just like really owning my power in those rooms, like, okay, have meetings around me. Have meetings around me.
Yeah.
That's fine.
Yeah.
I'm raising like 2, 3 million more than you ever were.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, look, the proof's in the pudding, right? And the bottom line is actually the bottom line. So, but I do think that that points to an interesting challenge. And maybe this is our last question. I mean, you and I could talk forever, but the CCF fundraising model and the model of like not doing a gala as an example is for a lot of people uncomfortable because it's new information and it's a new way of doing things. So for folks out there who are interested in starting with CCF but might be, working with a board that is not comfortable or working with an ED who is not comfortable or a development director that's not comfortable, what are the first steps that folks can take?
Oh man, I love this question. I think one of the tips that I heard someone say, I think it was Sarah Stager, she said, you don't need permission to become a community-centric fundraiser. which I loved. Yeah. So you don't need to write appeals in a overly sensational way, for example. Like you don't have to, and no one's going to notice. Like that's a small thing that you have power over. Same thing with like the imagery that you use and how you design things and what you choose to talk about. Those things are all in your control. If you want to talk about advocacy one-on-one with a major donor, that's not something that anyone will take away from you, right? When you're starting to look at like the bigger pieces, like a gala or something that might not align with your values as an organization, something that I like to do is gather as much evidence as possible. So kind of like do a mini audit of like why this isn't aligned with the organizational stated values. So it's not like, why doesn't this align with my values? Maybe they don't care. Maybe your values don't align with the organization, and that's a misalignment there. But how does this item not align with what we're saying publicly? So we're saying we really care about centering the community and everybody deserves a seat at the table. Then why are we excluding every single person who's not on the board from decision making, right? So maybe that's a community-centric principle that you can apply. And what is the gap there from what is actually happening currently to what could be possible for the organization? Once you find out what the gap is and what the things that you want to address are, you can actually move towards finding champions. So whether that's your EDs are usually really good champions for community-centric fundraising, is what
Mm,
I've found. If they have worked in nonprofit and they're not just like a corporate has been, like they're
mhm,
usually pretty good.
mhm,
Um, so EDs, external fundraisers, were also really helpful in my journey. Like, how are you doing this? Because I cannot figure it out, right? So you don't
mhm,
have to go and reinvent the wheel with each principle. There is a big community out there that's already been formed, that has already started testing these things, and you can build on that. So you don't have to do it on your own. And then also the other concern that people have is like around the money. Like, I'm not going to raise as much money, blah, 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 blah. That's not true. That's not true at all. So there's a lot of case studies out there to refute kind of these common concerns that people have. So the money one is one. They're like, oh, but if we don't take money from this source, then we can't take it from anywhere because no money is clean. Yeah, okay, I've heard that one before. There's like information on like how to address these things and how to work through them. But the hardest part is actually getting the buy-in on like the strategy. So that will take you the longest. So everything else will be easier than getting the buy-in, because the implementation, we've agreed, like we got the information, we have got our community members on board, our donors on board, but the actual buy-in internally is the hardest, in my opinion. So just like really doing the change management in a way that is very mindful of how everybody wants to participate, and like setting those rules of engagement early on in the conversation, that you're actually able to hold people accountable to them. So like we at the beginning we said these were our values as a team. Is that correct? Yes, that's correct. Okay. So here's what we're doing. Are there any things that are not aligned with that? So kind of let them lead the conversation of this is not aligned. Um through the questions and the information that you're providing. Like let them come to that conclusion, because that will be really helpful in getting that buy-in.
And like what you said at the beginning of the conversation, which is it's a process and a continuum, right? It's not going to happen overnight. It's not going to happen without awkward moments, without awkward conversations. You're probably going to stumble, but I think with the commitment towards moving toward in a general direction, that's really what I'm hearing is the important thing. It's like building the momentum, not being perfect, but committing to starting.
100%. Don't let perfect become the enemy of the good.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like
And
one
I
step forward is better than nothing.
Yeah. And I do think that there can be a tendency, especially as leaders, to shy away from things that might be uncomfortable or might be confrontational or might be upsetting, particularly to major donors. So I think the question here is like, do you have, as a leader, the moral courage to start to move in this direction?
Our integrity should not be up for sale. Like no amount of money from a major donor will get me to contradict my own values and participate in my own oppression or the oppression of my community. So, if you're in a position of power as a fundraiser or as a board member, as an ED, like how can you decide that that's okay? on my behalf or on behalf of any community member. Like it just doesn't seem right. So really thinking about like what role you want to play in the sector. Like, are you a glorified event planner or are you a champion for your service users, right? Like,
Mhm.
what are you? And really like living up to that expectation.
On that note, Maria, thank you so much. I will make sure that your information is in the show notes for folks who want to get in touch with you. But in the meantime, thank you. This was new learning for me too.
It was so nice to be here. I always love our conversations and yeah, I know it's a lot to learn. Like it's taken me years to get to this point. So, for anyone who might be hearing this and be completely overwhelmed, like start small, just start reading and then take it one step at a time.
And is the best way to get information about this on the website, or are there other resources you would recommend?
So I love the CCF Hub, which is on their website. It's been super helpful. And then you see a lot of contributors there who are actively talking about how they're creating CCF in their organizations and their communities and like just living up to that. So that for me is a huge one. And then following those creators. There's also the CCF Slack, which I think is okay, but I would stick with the hub a little bit more closely.
Okay, sounds good. Well, I am also on the Slack, and yeah, similarly, I was like, I don't know that this is for me. It gets a little spicy in there.
It's it's too big, I think. Like it just like it's hard to like have a meaningful conversation about like how do we, move something forward with
Yeah.
8,000 people.
Yeah, no, I think that what was off-putting for me was it just felt like there was a lot of ranting and venting and not a lot of like, okay, so this is like what the solution might be, or here's how we move forward. And it's like, I don't need more people like screaming in my life. It's just like
Yeah.
too
Yeah.
much.
Yeah. But I get it. Like people don't have a space to kind of talk about this, especially if you're like the only fundraiser at your organization, blah blah blah. But again, like I think we need to be pushing these things a lot farther, faster, harder, and it's hard to do that in a space of 8,000 people.
Yeah, agree.
But
Agree.
anyways,
All right, friend. Well, thanks so much again. And I think we're chatting soon on your podcast, no? At some point.
yeah,
All right, cool. Let's do it. All right. I'll talk to you soon. Thank you.
bye.